All right, I'm joined again by philosophers Daniel Vecchio and Pat Flynn to talk about another article that they've collaborated on together, which is provisionally titled Euthyphro 2.0, The Metaphysical Dilemma of God's Essence and Existence. So guys, in this paper, you show that there is a metaphysical dilemma facing a certain kind of theism, which you refer to as complex theism. So before we talk about the problem, maybe we should start here. What is this thing that you guys call complex theism? How does it relate to classical theism broadly, and then the doctrine of divine simplicity specifically?
Yeah, good. Let's jump right in, shall we, boys?
Right.
So, complex theism is any theism that is complex. How's that for a definition, right? But it's best understood in opposition to classical theism, which I believe has rightly held to the doctrine of divine simplicity. And the doctrine of divine simplicity says that God is absolutely ontologically simple, that God isn't built up from any prior parts in the broadest sense. And by parts, we don't just mean physical parts, but it could be property instances, tropes, you name it, right? And so complex theists in various ways bark at the doctrine of simplicity. They deny it. And to be fair to them, they've got their reasons for denial. They might think that the doctrine is just incoherent, what classical theists are saying about it, that God's essence is... Because classical theists, when they talk about the doctrine of divine simplicity, they really are saying that whatever is in God is God. So God is not only identical to his essence, it's identical to his active existence and any other real properties that he has. And yeah, there's some puzzles about that. I think those issues can be adequately addressed, but there's complex theists who think that maybe that's reason to just not be a classical theist. Others reject it because they think it doesn't have a biblical basis or that it is in conflict with certain scriptural data. Again, I think that is wrong. I think it also assumes a poor methodology as well. But there's reasons, right? There's reasons that the complex theists deny the doctrine of divine simplicity. And there's different kinds of complex theists as well. They aren't all the same, right? Neoclassical theists, process theists, so on and so forth. But they share, at least in the commitment, that God is not simple in the way that classical theists understand it. So, how's that for a start?
That's great.
Yeah, I just want to add that there are different ways of construing God's simplicity, right? That different theists will accept, for example, that God is not made of material parts, because God is immaterial. So most theists accept that kind of simplicity. But I guess we're going to categorize anyone as a complex theist who does not hold to the identity of God's essence and existence, right?
Yeah.
That those are distinct somehow in God leads to a kind of part relationship that we think is repugnant to reason.
Good. Well, let's talk about the metaphysical dilemma that you guys claim faces complex theism that you call the Euthyphro 2.0. So many who will end up listening to this episode will no doubt be familiar with the classical Euthyphro Dilemma. But if we could, let's start off with a refresher. So first, what is the structure of the classical Euthyphro Dilemma? And then what is the analogous dilemma for the complex theist that you guys are calling Euthyphro 2.0?
Yeah,
right.
Good. Daniel, did you want to?
Yeah, I can sort of set that up. So if you go back to Plato's Euthyphro, Socrates is talking to this self-proclaimed prophet, whose name is Euthyphro, and he claims he knows what piety is, right? So this is the actual original formulation. And Socrates is trying to nail down, as he always does in these dialogues, the form or essence of the term in question, which is piety. And he sets up various problems for Euthyphro with every definition he proposes. He says, piety is kind of what I'm doing right now in prosecuting my father. He's going to court to basically throw his dad in jail for killing a slave. And, that's sort of a question-begging sort of definition. So then he says it's what the gods love, or it's what all the gods love, right? Piety is what all the gods love. And then that sets up this dilemma. Well, do the gods love piety because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? And the actual analysis that Plato goes through is quite complex. Every time I read it, I get lost in the weeds. But it has kind of been refined in the literature and applied to the question of divine command theory. So the common sort of expression of the Euthyphro Dilemma that we now have is a question of whether God's commands are good because God commands it, or does God command those commands because they are good? And it seems that either way you take it, either horn of the dilemma, is unacceptable to divine command theory, because if it's the one, if it's God commands it because it is good, say, then morality seems independent of God, and if the commands are good because they're issued by God, then those commands seem arbitrary, since God issuing the command is now prior to the goodness. And so we're kind of taking that insight, which is really about explanation. What is prior to what in terms of explanatory order, and applying it in a broader context, if you will, sort of what we say, the sort of metaphysical question. So Pat, I'll pass the baton to you for giving a little background there.
Yeah, no, that was excellent. And I agree. Plato's sometimes a bit hard to figure out what he's up to. I'll just say, if people want to go down a particular road, I find the scholar Lloyd Gerson just fantastic on so many fronts.
Love Gerson.
Everything Platonism. Yeah, he's one of my favorites. But right, so and then, like, just to stick on the moral aspect for a minute, I mean, classical theists have always thought that the way you sort of deal with this dilemma is you dive between the horns, right? Because for classical theists, God just is the good, and there's no distinction between God's existence and God's goodness. And they have a sort of metaphysic to back that up, the theory of the transcendentals and the convertibility, right? And I think that's successful at the end of the day. I just find it a bit ironic how many non-classical theists will kind of like reach into the classical theist back pocket and kind of slip that card out when it's convenient, but then hard to square with how that actually fits in with a non-classical theistic view of God or non-classical theistic metaphysics, but who am I to judge? And so what we want to do is just take that general structure, this sort of, a little puzzle concerning prior explanatory ordering, and pose it towards complex theists, and essentially ask, hey, does God's essence exist because of his existence, or does God's existence exist because of his essence? And I think when you contemplate this for a while, which I think we'll all do here together, you find that neither of those is tenable, right?
Yeah.
That both sort of have absurd consequences. And then it puts the complex theists in a really uncomfortable position, just as I think Euthyphro puts non-classical theists in a comfortable position, just with respect to different things, right? That Euthyphro seems to make God irrelevant to the moral domain. It seems like our dilemma, that's pretty good, seems to make God irrelevant to the ontological domain as the ultimate anchor of why anything exists at all, unless what? Unless you dive between the horns, which would mean that God's essence is his existence, and then you, at that point, are just sort of accepting classical theism and divine simplicity. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So to restate the metaphysical Euthyphro dilemma, as you have it, quote from your paper, does God's essence exist because of God's existence, or does God's existence exist because of God's essence? And you put it this way also, is God what he is because of the fact that he is, or is the fact that God is because of what he is? So you can see it follows the same structure as the question posed to Euthyphro by Socrates. So in a moment, I'd like you guys to unpack this dilemma for us. But first, you say that your argument relies on a couple of assumptions that are widely held among theists. Can you explain the philosophical assumptions that are at work in your paper?
Yeah, good. There's at least two significant ones, and to be clear, these are not universally held among theists, but they've got a decent following. One is that some form of the relevant essentialism is true, and that's the idea that there are essences out there in the world, right? Real essences. So like a moderate realism would be perfectly fine here. Again, not all theists accept that, but I think it's really weird if you're a theist and a nominalist. So there's an essentialism at work, and by that I mean that we all have the same human essence, but they're numerically distinct in each of us, right? Individuated in each of us, and that's what grounds our real similarity, right? So for classical metaphysics, there could be real similarity that isn't strict logical identity, and essentialism helps to make sense of that. So that's an assumption. If you're not into essences, then this argument will probably be weird. And that's a different conversation. The other one is that existence is something that things have in a broad sense, or I think better put, or something that things really participate in. More specifically, that existence is a first level property of concrete individuals. We don't defend that assumption here, again, a lot. Not all theists accept it. I think it is the best theory of existence. I think it's super defensible, even against the most formidable objections. I think there's incredible work out there from Vallicella. Father Barry Miller's one of my favorites. Turner Nevitt, lots that do a lot of great work defending what's called the thick theory of existence. Certainly, it's a theory of existence that Aquinas held, and many, even Gerson would argue it goes well before Aquinas, especially the real distinction between essence and existence. So those are two off the top of my mind that we just sort of flag, and just to be fair, right. These are kind of assumed here. So right, yeah. Daniel, am I missing anything?
No, those were the two. So it sort of leads to a constituent ontology, right?
Right.
And so that's the sort of background we're working from. So you might say, well, what if a theist isn't committed to that? Well, certainly that would explain, I think, some level of being a complex theist. But I think
That's
the
right.
dilemma would still could be pressed against them. And I'm not sure that they're going to have the resources to really account for it. I think that but we're showing that once you sort of have these background assumptions, it sort of helps you address the dilemma.
Yeah.
So,
and let me say, just popped in my mind, that's actually a good point, right? Is that, like, I think if you don't hold to these commitments, you're going to have major issues with explanations in general, since I think an essentialist project of explanation is the best one on offer. And I think it sort of underwrites a lot of what other people think about explanations, like Bayesian updates or something like that. Like, it seems to me that they always trace back to the essences of things and their powers or dispositions, right? So, yeah, I definitely want to say that. And then I think also, and our paper focuses on this a lot, like if you're going to try to get an explanation for true ontological independence, man, I don't like a thick theory of existence does a lot of really good work there. So you might have reason to consider these resources precisely because you're trying to find good answers to tough and deep metaphysical questions. At least that's what appeals to me.
Well, everybody's got to start with certain assumptions, and as far as assumptions go, these are pretty good ones, pretty safe ones in my opinion. Nominalism, if you're going to deny realism, you got all kinds of problems. So assuming realism is pretty safe. But even with the thick theory of existence, I think you could probably say, I don't know if you guys would agree with me, but all of the traditional arguments from God, the classical arguments of God, just get you to a thick theory of existence at the end of the day, is how I kind of read some of Aquinas's arguments particularly. But anyway.
It's an interesting thought, right? I think some do. I wonder if others assume them. I think it'd have to be a sort of case by case.
Yeah, I guess you could argue what extent do each of Aquinas's five ways depend on his argument from the De Ante. Yeah.
But I mean, even with Aquinas, like, he thinks that this theory of existence does a ton of descriptive and explanatory work in metaphysics and in general, right? So he doesn't just assume it, like it does. The essence existence distinction does serious work for the problem of the one and the many. Like it's doing work in metaphysics entirely apart from arguments for the existence of God. And it's just, and like Miller too will be like, no, this is just like common thought and common language. So a lot of what Miller does to argue for the thick theory of existence is just to show this is our default starting point with common thought and common language. Socrates exists, so many examples, right? And since all the arguments against it are very bad, it's a good position to just start from, right? So there's lots of ways to kind of motivate it, but we don't have to spend too much time on this because we do make it just an assumption on paper. But go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I just wanted to add, the point about being an explanatory resource. These sort of assumptions, you might say, well, one of the motivations for nominalism, famously, was Occam's razor, or the principle of parsimony. And I was sort of talking about this with Pat, that one of the problems with this principle is how it's usually misapplied. That is, the idea is, if you have a sort of explanation that's sufficient, right, then you can cut away the things that aren't necessary. But often it's the case that people have their ontological commitments about what should be simple. They cut things away, and then they feverishly try to explain things with the limited resources they're left with, right? So now they're stuck trying to explain, consciousness, or they're stuck trying to explain morality, having cut away things like essences and God and so forth, right? And so that's the project of naturalizing things that's always been famously, it's a promissory note that we're all waiting for them to make good on. And their point was, well, it's simple, but there are lots of explanatory virtues, right? And you don't want to start cutting away and saying, well, my priority in explanation is simplicity, and so I'm just going to go to bare bones and then try to do as much explaining as possible. So that's sort of a setup, anyways.
That's good. And I don't want to hold us up here at the threshold, but I guess I was thinking that any argument that gets you to pure actuality is going to, once you kind of philosophically reflect on the notion, it's going to get you to subsistent existence. And then if you're going to account for creation, you're going to need some kind of a model of participation, or anyway.
No, that's a good thought. I think there's something to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, excellent. Well, let me get out of your way. Please walk us through this metaphysical Euthyphro.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Where should we begin? I always like to we examine this in the paper. Look at ways that complex theists have tried to make sense of or argue for God, and show that I think that there's some issues that can be brought against them by the naturalists, particularly certain parity arguments where the naturalists will say, hey, whatever you're saying about God, I can just say about my natural entity, and then I can bring in Occam's razor and I can shave your God off, and naturalism is a sort of better theory. So, I mean, a classic example of this is just to say that God is a necessary being, right? So complex theists, many of them, but not all, will say, well, God exists because he's a necessary being, and we know there has to be a necessary being because of the contingency argument, right? Well, the problem with this is there seems to be all sorts of necessary truths and realities that still have deeper explanations, moral truths, mathematical truths, you name it, right? So just insofar as something is necessary doesn't necessarily mean that it's an explanatory stopping point. What we really want is something that isn't just necessary, but the right sort of thing to be truly ontologically independent, or ase. So if the complex theist has a God that is composed of different parts and attributes, property instances, tropes, whatsoever, right? And all that stuff is just sort of just glued together for no real reason at all. It seems like, okay, even if you want to say God is a necessary reality, he's not relevantly different from the types of things that the naturalists can claim is a necessary reality. And that's exactly what naturalists do. We cite a few in our paper who make these parity arguments against certain theists who try to show that God is a stopping point, but they say, well, look, your God isn't really anything you say about your God, I can say about my natural entity. So you say God is a physical reality. Well, I'm just going to say the initial singularity or the initial phase of the physical universe is the necessary reality, and then I can make some vague gestures towards quantum indeterminism, and that's how we get all the contingent stuff, right? So look, the naturalist has necessity and contingency. Our story covers the data just like yours, and we can bring in Occam's razor and lop God off, right?
Yeah, and so the question is, who is the least brute facts in their system? who's more simple. That's sort of where that debate goes, right? That, by bruteness, I mean that at the end of the day, both seem to say, well, there's no explanation for, say, God's necessity, or there's no explanation for this, uh, metaphysical necessary furniture of reality upon which everything else is built. It's just there. It has to be there. We don't know why, but it is. And so that sort of, we want to flag that and say, look, well, bruteness isn't an explanation, right? It's the lack of explanation. Sometimes people will appeal to bruteness as a kind of black box explanation. Well, what explains it is that it's brute.
No, it doesn't. Right? Yeah, right. So, all right, so let's build this out a little bit further. So there's this kind of clever naturalist strategy, which I think is pretty effective against complex theists, where they'll essentially say, hey, what's good for the theist is good for the naturalist. And I just gave you an example, right? You say God is necessary. I'll just say some segment of the universe or physical reality is necessary, and I've got a story about contingency. In which case, the theist might try to say something about God's essence. Well, it's just the essence of God that sort of guarantees his. You hear this among classical theists, like it's God's essence that sort of guarantees, or even somehow includes, his existence as a feature, or constituent, or part, or something like that. And the problem with that is twofold. One is it seems like the naturalist can say the exact same thing about any physical reality, or well, he can just say, well, it's just the nature or essence of the initial singularity or whatever that just guarantees its existence necessarily, or its inclusion into reality. But both of them, we think, fall prey to the actual dilemma, right? That if you have a real distinction, if you hold to this particular theory of existence, and you have a real distinction between the essence and existence of something, that answer that the essence is explanatorily prior is going to wind up to be, I would say, not just incoherent. We argue it's incoherent in this paper, but I would argue it's actually contradictory, which kicks to my other paper, the Mullerian paper. And I think the initial reason for this is like pretty darn simple, right? I mean, so if the essence is this sort of is the ontologically prior thing that's supposed to ground the existence, how can that possibly be the case, right? Because apart from its existence, that essence is nothing, right? It literally has no actuality whatsoever. So set temporal priority aside. We can just focus on ontological or grounding or explanatory priority, right? This is a clear notion that metaphysicians talk about a lot. In fact, it relates to the idea of metaphysical dependence that we talked about in our previous episode, right? If the essence element is supposed to be ontologically prior, it can't do any work. It can't do any causal or explanatory work whatsoever unless it already has some actuality, right? Which is to say it already exists, in which case it can't possibly be the ground or the explanation for its existence as a feature or component because it is prior to it, right? So that's an initial statement, and then we can examine the other one if you try to go existence first. But I think that's enough to just get on the table for some initial thoughts from Daniel.
Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, David.
Well, basically, then should we delve into the dilemma itself?
Yeah. So Pat just gave us the first horn of the metaphysical Euthyphro. So we can clarify that, or we can go to the second horn.
Well, real quick, we have a few principles in the paper that might be helpful to trot out that we make use of.
Sure.
And one of the principles we have that's related to what I just said is what we call the principle of action dependence. We call this the PAD principle. And that's the idea that nothing can act unless it's already something actual, right? That it's already something with a determinate essence. So we'll come back to that one in a minute. The other principle we have is what we call the principle of parthood dependence. And here we say that a part can only be meaningfully identified as such if it belongs to a whole that already exists as a unified entity, right? I mean, this just seems so obviously true.
Pretty intuitive.
It hardly deserves statement that without a whole, there is nothing for it to be a part of. And really what we do is we show that with these two, I think, extremely plausible, if not undeniable principles, either option for the Euthyphro, metaphysical Euthyphro, is going to be untenable. So, yeah, just wanted to throw those ones out there. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the central idea is that then if God is metaphysically complex, that's going to imply that God's existence is somehow either going to be explained by the essence of God being conjoined with the fact that there's a sense in which God's existence is a metaphysical part of God's essence, right? So there's sort of we're saying it's the essence that explains it because existence is somehow contained in there, or on the other hand, that God's essence is explained by the fact that it's somehow a kind of fusion with God's existence, right? That's what explains it. And we take that either side of that, right, where you start with it's the existence explaining the essence or the essence explaining the existence. What you really get is a sort of metaphysical impossibility, what we say.
Yeah.
So just yep. Sorry, Daniel, finish your thought and I'll hop in. Yep.
No, Go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so, I mean, take the first option, right? If God's existence is a part of his essence, where we say that essence is doing the grounding work here, then his essence, in some real sense, must be ontologically prior to his existence, right? So, because his existence cannot be a part of his essence unless his essence is already there, so to speak, to ground it, right? A whole must exist before it can be intelligibly said to have parts, constituents, components, etc. So if something is truly a part of something's essence, right, follows from its essence or whatever, its very identity as a part depends on the prior or at least simultaneous, we consider this option later, it doesn't work, of the existence as the whole. But I mean, how can that be, right? Because apart from God's existence, there's no actuality. His essence would be indistinguishable from nothing. It would literally be nothing. So that seems to immediately rule out the first option. On the other hand, if his existence is prior to his essence, which does seem the more intuitive route, since existence is what accounts for actuality, right? Mm-hmm. Then that must somehow cause or ground his essence. But in that case, existence would not be part of God's essence, because if it was already there and ontologically prior and in a broad sense causally responsible for his essence, then it exists as something in its own right by our other principle, or it exists as something with a particular essence of its own, which we would argue just is unrestricted being or pure actuality. In which case, it just becomes metaphysically absurd to suggest that it could like mutate its own essence at that point, because then at that point it's not the same thing anymore. It would be a completely different entity. So that's a general like 10,000 foot overview of how we think either approach ultimately doesn't work. Of course, there's more details and objections we consider, but hopefully that gets the general thrust across. Yeah.
Let me see if I can summarize this. So if you're a complex theist, it means by default you are. By definition, you're denying divine simplicity, which says that God's existence just is his essence, or that God's essence just is his existence. So you're introducing some kind of composition into God at a fundamental level. But then you guys are saying, but if that's the case, then we have a dilemma that's structurally similar to the Euthyphro problem. And a dilemma, of course, is we have two options. Neither option is attractive. Both lead to problems. So what's the first horn of the dilemma? As you said, the first option would be that God's essence includes his existence, right? Or includes something like his necessary existence as a part. This is complex theism. But if existence is a part of God's essence, then God's essence has ontological priority over his existence, insofar as the whole has ontological priority over the parts. But this option is incoherent because God's essence would already have to exist prior to having existence or necessary existence as a part. So it seems like we run into incoherence on the first horn. But then the second horn of the dilemma is that God's existence is somehow, God's existence as a part is somehow prior to and the ground of God's essence. So God's existence is prior on this horn. But this also is incoherent, right? Because for existence to exist prior to God's essence, it would have to already exist as something with an essence of its own. Mm-hmm. But then it couldn't be part of God's essence, but rather an independent entity in its own right. Is that the basic gist of the
beautiful poetry?
Metaphysical Euthyphro?
Again. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Perfectly put.
Okay, where do we want to move from here? So what you guys do a lot in this paper. I mean, it is jam-packed. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of technical things we try to work through, some of which are probably not totally worth discussing on the podcast, but people who want to go deeper can read the paper for it, right?
Well, what's interesting is you talk about this dilemma that faces the complex theist that we just laid out, a metaphysical dilemma. But then you talk about ontological independence kind of along the way as well. Like, it seems to me that you guys are highlighting two distinct issues. We have a dilemma where both horns are either metaphysically impossible or incoherent, but also a complex theist has a problem of, can I say, a problem of explanatory adequacy, right? How is your complex God, how does it have any deep metaphysical explanation that is superior to what a naturalist could provide, right? So it's like you're attacking this idea of complex theism on two fronts. Am I seeing that right?
Yeah, it's right. Not only do we think that there's a dilemma that is a serious issue for accounting for God's self-existence, right, or independence, we also think that this exposes as quite effective these naturalist attacks against complex theists, because if you're just going to sort of brutally bundle necessary existence into a suite of attributes, like, well, why can't the naturalist do the same thing, right? But on the other hand, like, if you already have a thick theory of existence, I think this is an important point, right? Then being a classical theist with respect to divine simplicity is a really nice ontological stopping point. I mean, like, it's why? Because it's relevantly different, right? Yeah. And this is what has always motivated classical theism in the first place, is that, all the philosophers have tried to identify all the sorts of things that don't seem to be the right sort of thing that can be truly ontologically dependent. Why? Because they have contingency implying features. The big one, of course, is composition, right? Metaphysical composition between potency and act, essence, existence, form, matter, substance, attribute, all that stuff, right? But also, there's other indicators as well. Mutability, which I think just does reveal metaphysical composition. Finitude, which again I think reveals metaphysical composition. Becoming, which I think reveals metaphysical. I think they all kind of like trace back, but they're different angles in. So like anything that is qualitatively finite, mutable, changing, composite, none of these things are the right sort of thing to be the ultimate anchor of everything, right? And this is what has always motivated classical theists, because classical theists think that you do have good arguments to show that there must be a truly ontologically independent entity, and that what that entity is must lack all these contingency implying features. It must be relevantly different. Yeah. And that's what drives us to an entity that is totally bereft of any composition, including metaphysical composition, an entity whose essence just is its existence, and in turn is absolutely simple, qualitatively unrestricted or infinite, purely actual. And then, like, say whatever you want about the coherence around that. I think it is coherent. What I think is undeniable is, like, this seems like a really different sort of thing, right?
That's right.
A truly principled, different sort of thing that...
and it's like, not something the naturalist can just copy. It's
they
not
can't co-opt that, right? Yeah,
because
because it's this sort of conceptual demand of what the ultimate autonomous fact would have to be, and then you realize that no natural entity could fit that definite
and
description.
If they started describing a natural entity to meet that description, well, then they're just describing God.
They're just describing God. That's exactly right. So that I think is a really important point, and I think if anybody wants to understand why are classical theists from a philosophical perspective, is that, I mean, like, straight
That's
up.
Right.
But then also our dilemma shows that if you don't accept that, then, like, you're all on the same metaphysical footing, and the complex theist doesn't really have any advantage, right? Really, not like a really good principled one over the naturalist. And in fact, they might have some significant disadvantages depending on how you determine, like, certain theoretical virtues like simplicity and stuff like that.
Good.
Yeah, is that helpful? Does that make sense?
That's
Daniel,
super helpful.
Help me out. Yeah,
No,
I know you got a lot to say.
That was very good. I don't know if I could add too much to make that even better, but the fundamental issue here, when you get down to that kind of whatever you want to call it, that part of reality that is the ground of everything else, if we say it's complex itself, then you're literally asking yourself, well, which part goes before the other? And if you say, I don't know, or it doesn't matter, it's going to be an unsatisfying answer. So you say, well, it's existence, right? Like something in me says that might be the more intuitive answer. We'll put existence at the foundation, but distinguish it from its essence. As you said, well, then what is it? Well, as soon as you ask that, you're talking about an essence. And if you say, well, it doesn't have an essence, but it has this ability to actualize an essence, well, that sounds like it's omnipotent and unlimited to do that, right?
That's right.
And so you end up kind of just basically, and that's what a point we kind of are trying to bring out is a lot of these theists end up kind of working their way into classical theism, as you said, Pat, kind of slipping the wallet out the back pocket, kind of talking about a form of simplicity that they just don't want to go the full way, but you end up there. You do.
Too spooky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can think, okay, let me give you guys an objection for an objection to the Euthyphro, the metaphysical Euthyphro, and then we can look at an objection that you guys actually raise for this notion of ontological dependence. So with the Euthyphro, so your contention is that to split the horns of the dilemma, you have to embrace divine simplicity. You basically have to be a classical theist with a fairly strong doctrine of divine simplicity. But what if the complex theist wants to push back and say, hang on, why can't all the parts of God's essence, including his necessary existence, just be simultaneous with God's essence?
Yeah, good. And we did include this in the paper. I'm not sure if you saw
did.
that. Yeah. So yeah, let me address that right on, because I think that we do have instances of simultaneity, or at least it's not hard to imagine them, right? So I think in the paper I give example of God bringing about a s'mores Pop-Tart, just to show the sorts of things that I'm into, right? Where the whole and its parts like just come into existence simultaneously, right? You know, God just, boom, there it is. Right. What's the problem with that? Why can't that be the case? Well, here, we're not considering a caused entity, where a cause simultaneously brings about the essence and existence and all of its parts simultaneously. We're talking about an uncaused entity. And this is what's gonna propose the problem, right? Where there's no external cause that's available to accomplish this sort of work for the simultaneity proposal to work. So I'll just read from the paper at this point. So what is supposed to account for the actuality of this essence or existing entity is either, since this is uncaused, right? We have to account for the actuality or essence either by the existence of the part of the essence or the whole essence itself. And when you reflect on that, it just re-raises the issue, because the fundamental problem we've been attempting to highlight is if one wants to say that it's the existence part that actualizes the remainder of the essence, then this is nonsense, because for the existence part to act as the cause of the essence, it would have to be something that was already there before the essence. It would already have an essence of its own, right? But if that's the case, then it cannot possibly make itself a part of some other essence. I mean, that's absurd, because then it would be an entirely different thing altogether. So the point with the simultaneity thing is that the only time that actually seems to make sense is when you have a productive cause that can be the unifier of things, constituencies, all at once, right? Which I think God is. God is the immediate productive cause unifier of our constituencies. But when we're talking about an uncaused thing, and we ask, well, what accounts for its existence or actuality, then we are forced to look at one or two of these principles as having priority,
right?
If we want to avoid just another brute fact account, which I'm assuming is the case, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I would summarize it this way, if this makes sense, to talk about a sort of non-causal explanatory simultaneity is kind of just to say something like there just is no explanatory priority here.
Yeah.
Which then is, I think,
which is silly, because
it's just saying it's brute.
Well, right? and I want to go further than that, because the whole reason we posit essence and existence is to provide an explanatory role, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. So then to say that there's no priority here, especially for its existence, is like it defeats the whole logic of having these explanatory entities in the first place, right? It would ultimately be just self-undermining of the entire project. Like, the existence of something is supposed to account for the actuality of a thing, whereas the essence of something is supposed to account for its determinate whatness.
Yeah.
And so like there clearly has to be priority here. Now, I also think that there can be differing priorities in differing respects. And I talk about this in some of my other work where, essence can be prior in a certain sense, right? Prior with respect to completion or individuation, whereas existence is prior in another respect for actuality. But right, when it comes to looking at an uncaused cause, you have to account for why this thing is self-sufficient at the end of the day, and you have to look at one of those two principles to actually do the explanatory work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what just to build up the point, right? So if you say it's simultaneous in a sort of non-priority way, just to sort of flag off or wave off the idea that it's that there is an explanation here, that again is brute. But what we're saying is the way to do this, right, where you have a kind of, I guess, simultaneous priority here, is to go the identity route, because then you are saying, well, it's not that one is the issue. Is when you separate them and then say, well, neither is prior, then you just don't have an explanation. But we're not separating them, so we're saying, yeah, it is simultaneous in the sense that it's one thing, right? It's identical. So that is the explanatory ground. And so we don't have to worry about the problem of which is prior to which. If you want to say, well, I don't want to worry about which is prior to which, but I want to separate them, that's when you have the problem.
Yeah, and you can't just stomp your foot and say, well, God has the property of necessary existence, because now it just seems like you have this really special brute facty kind of thing going on, right? Mm-hmm. And the naturalists can do the same thing. And this brings me to, okay, so this question's more targeted at the ontological priority aspect of this. What if we bring in the notion of a perfect being? Mm-hmm. If we import the notion of a perfect being into this, can we save the complex theist? Why can't we just say that God has unique ontological independence because God is uniquely a perfect being? Why can't we just say that a absolutely perfect being, if a being is absolutely perfect, necessarily they have the property of necessary existence, and thus contra naturalism, only a perfect being is the kind of being that can be ontologically independent or a se.
Yeah, good. So at first I want to commend this proposal, because the idea between perfection and imperfection does seem like a relevant difference, right? But then I want to say two other things against the complex theists using it. The first is that, at least initially, it's not clear that this is an alternative proposal to classical theism. I mean, if we understand perfection to be absolute rather than kind relative perfection, right? This would seem to imply simplicity anyways, right? I mean, within the history of ontological argumentation, the biggest thinkers, including Anselm, thought that perfection demanded absolute simplicity or unity.
That's right.
For pretty much the considerations we're talking about, right? Like, it's more perfect to have that tight degree of unity and not be dependent upon anything really distinct from oneself. And the problem with these sorts of ontological arguments in general is you have these intuitions, but I mean, like, man, if any intuition is strong and reliable for that, I think that's one. So it might itself just point us right back to simplicity. I would also argue that, theoretically, if you're going to build out a theory of perfection, it's going to be downstream from pure actuality, right? What makes sense, and Aquinas has a theory of perfection, right? But it's downstream from his theory of existence. So I think when you actually try to put this idea to work, you're going to need something a bit deeper to actually do the theoretical heavy lifting when you try to spell it out. But more to the point, I think another problem emerges if you're a complex theist, right? So if existence is itself just merely a part of perfection, then all the other parts, including perfection itself, would then depend on existence to be present in reality. And that just seems like a contradiction, right? That something is both perfect and dependent at the same time in one of its parts. That just seems like straight nonsense to me. So I think the idea there is, like, as a complex theist trying to embrace perfection, not only does it seem to point towards the simplicity, when you try and situate it in a complex theist framework, it just seems to contradict the very idea of perfection to begin with. Does that make sense? Yeah, Daniel, sorry, you want to add something there?
No, I was just going to say that the problem kind of reemerges is basically the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great job, guys. Let's see if we can wrap this up, maybe by having you guys, just for the audience, just to reiterate the goal in the paper. What is the concluding lesson that we should take away from the metaphysical Euthyphro and your analysis of ontological priority here?
Daniel, you go first this time.
Yeah, so the takeaway here is, again, looking back to the original Euthyphro and what you find in the literature, many contemporary philosophers are happy to say that dilemma is solved through identity. God is somehow the good, right? And they often mean it in a pretty much a classical theistic sense. And then that insight can be very helpful then for this broader question of God's essence and existence. Which is prior to which? Well, that problem doesn't arise if we posit an identity relation between God's essence and existence. God is God's existence is God's essence in a sort of strict sense. When you try to untether the two, and then it is subject to this question of which is prior to which. And what we find is either way you put one ahead of the other or one before the other, or one prior to the other, you end up with a problem, you end up with bruteness, or you end up saying somehow that existence can be apart from essence. And somehow explain the essence, or that essence can somehow be contained within it, existence, or something like that. And it just doesn't really seem to fully work out metaphysically. You end up with something that's a bit of a Frankenstein, and something that a naturalist can readily parody. So that's how I would summarize it.
Great. That's it. Yeah. No, not much to add there. It was good.
All right. Well, Daniel, Pat, thanks for this. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Anthony. As always, a joy.